My name is Dr. Tali Loewenthal, and I'm going to be sharing with you some information about the course Rabbi Moses Maimonides in Jewish Thought and History. So he was born possibly 1135. There's evidence for a slightly later date. His name is Rabbi Moses Maimonides, also known as Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, which makes the Hebrew way he is referred to Rambam. Not to be confused with a Ramban with an N at the end, which is Nachmanides, not Maimonides, but Nachmanides. Rabbi Moses ben, that means the son of Nachman. So he is another great scholar who lived a generation later in Spain, in Barcelona. Now here we have the statue of Maimonides, which is in his birthplace, Cordoba, and in Andalusia, which means southern Spain, particularly in the time of Islamic Spain. He was a key figure in Jewish thought and history, and also a very controversial figure. So the point of this course is to give us an informed outline of his writings, some of which are in Hebrew, some in Judeo-Arabic. That's Arabic written in Hebrew letters, and we'll be using English translations. Someone doesn't have to know either Arabic or Hebrew in order to follow this course. We will try to critically consider his effects on the Jewish and non-Jewish world and the varied responses to him in his own time and in subsequent centuries. Now, there's a kind of a joke. Who's Maimonides? Maimonides. Diverse, often conflicted groups in Judaism often claim Maimonides as their own. And as you can see here, they're halachists, scholars of Jewish law, rationalist philosophers or thinkers, some Kabbalists, but not others, some 18th century Hasidim, and the very opposite, 18th century Enlightenment, 19th century Reform Judaism. And then we have Lithuanian Talmudists. And there are also some contemporary Hasidic groups, particularly Chabad. Maimonides is very widely studied in the Jewish world among very diverse people. Now, his sources of knowledge, just to get something about his background, of course, the Bible, traditional Jewish texts, Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash. The Gaonim were the sages who preceded him in Babylon, that's Iraq, and their halachic writings. Saadia Gaon was one of the Gaonim, and he wrote a philosophical work. There were great rabbis of the recent past, like Rabbi Isaac al-Fassi, known as the Rif of Fez, Morocco. Then there's Greek philosophical thought, particularly Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wrote in Greek. Maimonides did not know Greek, but he accessed it through the discussions and analyses of Islamic philosophers, such as the Afghani, possibly, or he might have come from Turkey, the great polymath Al-Farabi, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, who was Iranian, and Maimonides' own contemporary Averroes, otherwise known as Ibn Rushd, who lived in Andalusia in Spain. Now then there was the Kalam, an Islamic system of philosophy which Maimonides often criticized. That's quite distinct from Greek thought. Medical writings by physicians such as Galen. He had information about the Sabians, a polytheistic society, and these various sources of knowledge all informed his thinking, together with many other books and ideas as well. Just as a kind of a gimmick, let's have a look at the geography of Maimonides. So we here have the Mediterranean Sea and its various countries around the Mediterranean. So we can see on the one hand, he was born in Cordoba in Andalusia. Then his family moved to Morocco to escape the Almohade persecution. And he studied in Fez, which is marked there on the map. He traveled by sea to the land of Israel and then Egypt, and he resided in Fustat, and that is where he lived the rest of his life and where most of his books were written. His Arabic writings were translated into Hebrew by scholars in Provence and also Spain. He had an ongoing conflict with Rabbi Shmuel ben Ali, head of the Torah Academy in Baghdad. And when he died in 1204, his body was taken to Tiberias in Israel on the Kinneret, and that's where he was buried. After his death, there was a fierce controversy about him, involving rabbis in Provence, in Italy, Spain, and North France as well, the town of Sens. And it's rabbis in North France who gave 2 of his works to the Inquisition to be burnt. They were actually burnt in Montpellier, which is in the south, but it seems to have been a result of some kind of North French agitation against him because of his philosophy. On the other hand, his Jewish legal writing had a strong influence on Rabbi Joseph Caro, who wrote the main code of Jewish law in Aleppo in Syria. So there we have another geographical point. And this code of law had a global effect and continues to have a global effect on Jewish life. And so very much Maimonides is part of that. Let's consider some works by him. There's a letter, a long letter called Letter on Apostasy, Igeret Hashmad, originally in Judeo-Arabic. That version of it has not survived, but a Hebrew translation has, and also the English translations. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, which he wrote in Judeo-Arabic. He wrote a book of the commandments also in Judeo-Arabic, similarly Mishnah Torah, which he wrote in Hebrew. Guide of the Perplexed, and then 10 Arabic works on medicine. Now let's look at these in a little more detail. The letter on apostasy. As a result of the Almohad persecution, which forced many Jews to accept Islam, there came the question of how the Jewish community should treat those who had converted. So there was an anonymous rabbi who claimed they should be rejected in every way. Don't let them into the synagogue. If they want a child to be circumcised, don't do that, have nothing to do with them. They betrayed Judaism. Maimonides wrote an open letter strongly criticizing this view. He said instead they should be welcomed in every way. He said dying for the sake of Judaism as being threatened, baptism or death or Islam or death, it's a great ideal. But if someone did not do so, he or she should not be blamed. Further, he pointed out, Islam is not an idolatrous religion, but he did advise Jews to flee from the areas where such persecution might take place. Now we go on to the commentary on the Mishnah. For scholars of the Mishnah, it's a clear explanation of each Mishnah with the basic points expressed in the discussion of the Mishnah, which is called the Gemara, and they're usually published together in a volume called the Talmud. However, his commentary on the Mishnah also includes a very famous text, the 13 Principles of Faith, included in many Jewish prayer books. It also includes ethical teachings in a section called 8 Chapters, actually an introduction to the commentary on the ethics of the fathers. He also wrote an introduction to the entire oral law, and all these works are very relevant. He wrote a book of the commandment, which can be seen as countering the Karaites who rejected the oral law. And this book of the commandments presents the source in scripture, that means in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, for each of the 613 commandments of Jewish teaching. It gives a brief but meaningful explanation what the commandment is in practical terms. The order in which the commandments appear in this book has puzzled scholars. It's not in the order of scripture, of the Torah, which the Sefer HaChinuch, for example, the book of education, which is doing a very similar thing, follows the order of the Torah. The book of the commandments written before that does not do that. So it is widely studied today in the order in which the commandments appear in Maimonides' book, Mishnah Torah. Now this Mishnah Torah, the word means repetition of the Torah. It's also called Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand, and it's divided into 14 books. And the word Yad has a numerical value in Hebrew of 14. Now, it's a very clear, highly organized presentation of all Jewish law from the Talmud. It includes even those laws only relevant in the time of the temple. It presents unusually Noahide laws for non-Jews and a depiction of the coming of the Messiah. It doesn't give its Talmudic sources, which makes it easier to read as a book, but that was also a source of criticism. However, lots of people since then have written commentaries on it, pointing out what his sources were. Some people feared this book was intended to supplant the Talmud. However, as mentioned, it became one of the three main works used by Rabbi Joseph Caro in compiling his Code of Law. Now, another work very different is the Guide of the Perplexed. And this book is generally thought to help a Jewish person who is perplexed by Greek philosophy. It helps him or her cope with the contrast between philosophy and traditional Jewish thought. Now, this is partly true, but we could also see the book as demanding philosophic quest from the person who is learned in Talmud. The idea implicit in this book is that just study of Talmud is not enough. The goal is to have intense love of the divine. And Maimonides thought the way to reach this intense love of the divine is through philosophical contemplation. And he also looks at what aspects of Jewish teaching would perplex a philosopher, such as anthropomorphism in the Bible. And Maimonides explains in the guide that this anthropomorphic imagery in the Bible is only intended as a metaphor, but each metaphor has specific meaning. Now, other parts of the guide discuss many interesting topics, such as prophecy and divine providence. It contains a kind of commentary on the book of Job. It includes proofs for the existence of God. It is a fascinating work. And as mentioned, its goal is to promote intense love of the divine. Now, the influence of Maimonides. Mishnah Torah is an important basis of contemporary Jewish law. At the same time, his focus on the spiritual life of the individual and the importance of contemplation of the divine, that influenced Hasidism. His writings present a concern for a pure conception of the divine beyond anthropomorphism, which was a popular way of thinking about God. And this pure conception of the divine is particularly significant, perhaps, in a secular age, such as we live in now. Maimonides recognizes the particularism of Judaism, but also teaches its universalist aspect. He presents a philosophical, meditative approach to the meaning of the commandments. Now, his specific philosophical explanations written in the guide are not popular, but the idea that the commandments can have a moral and spiritual refining effect on a person is widespread. Now, he claimed in the guide that many commandments have the goal to wean the Jewish people away from idolatry. Some readers use this idea to justify abrogating observance of some commandments, as in 19th century reform in Germany. Now, further, his combination of medical knowledge and practice as a physician with his great knowledge of Torah provides an example of the unification of, quote, science and, quote, Torah for many Jews in the modern world. Now, his guide and some parts of Mishnah Torah were translated into Latin and influenced Christianity through the writings of Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, and other figures. His writings about the advent of the Messiah present a rational rather than apocalyptic way of conceiving that moment and the Messianic age, and his clear presentation of all Jewish law from the Talmud is often used by Talmudists, especially of the Lithuanian school, in order to illuminate Talmudic texts and ideas. His philosophical influence thinkers such as Spinoza, Leibniz, Moses Mendelssohn, Levinas, and others. Now, some topics we will explore are the life of Maimonides, his letter on apostasy, which was mentioned earlier, Mishnah Torah and its effect on Jewish law and thought, his teachings on the nature of the divine, the 13 principles of faith and responses to them, and the guide of the perplexed, its significance in Jewish thought and beyond Judaism. We may also explore, and we'll have to pick out which ones to take in our short one-term course, the Maimonides controversy, what is the role of philosophy in Jewish thought, various themes in his works, such as ethical teachings, prophecy, the book of Job and divine providence, the theme of creation. How do you teach the importance of belief in God and the belief that God is essential for the existence of the universe to people who do not believe in creation? They follow Aristotle and they think the world is eternal. It always has existed and always will exist. That is an issue that Maimonides addressed. We would also look at women in the thought of Maimonides. They're not very obvious, and it's important to try to understand what he did say about women and think about women. There's also his relationship with mysticism, how he was viewed by Kabbalists and Hasidim, and his image for the 18th century Haskalah and for the Lithuanian Talmudic tradition, his influence on Hasidism, and the 7 Noachide laws, and there, which he writes about in the end of his Mishnah Torah, and what is their significance for contemporary society. So hopefully we'll pick out some of these topics. Assessment in this course is by essay. There's supposed to be 2 essays, each one 1,500 to 2,000 words. You can choose a title from the list of suggested essay titles or make one up of your own based on discussion with me. It's important to keep to style sheet rules, and it's important to be on time. And if you can see there's going to be a problem regarding getting the essay finished on time, please communicate with me. And then there's various tutors who we have to address to try and help you. Here are some sample essay titles. Who is the real Maimonides? The author of Mishnah Torah or the author of the guide? Some people thought these were really 2 different people. And there were some Jewish thinkers who thought the author of one could not be the author of the other. Outline the Maimonides controversy, discuss its implications for Judaism. What's the significance of Mishnah Torah for Jewish thought and life? What's the goal of the guide of the perplexed? Discuss his view of the commandments and responses to his views in later generations. What's the significance of the 13 principles of faith for Jewish thought? And the relationship between Maimonides and the Jewish mystical tradition. These are just 7 possible essay titles, but there are lots more, which will be on your course handouts. From Moses to Moses. On Maimonides' tomb in Tiberias, the top inscription reads in Hebrew, from Moses, that means the lawgiver, to Moses Maimonides, there arose none like Moses. And so that really sums up the special character of this very, very unique figure in Jewish history. And if you take this course, I hope that you enjoy it and get a lot of benefit from it. Thank you very much.